I'm feeling a little off after these many days, right? So I really do appreciate everyone being here. It's odd. I feel like we've all been here for 20 years. Is anyone with me on this yet? Yeah, right? Okay. Ooh, good. Good. I just like knowing I'm not alone. I do really appreciate everyone being here. It's an honor. These are my co-authors. I am going to do my best to try and represent. The title of my talk is Context Matters, especially during times of conflict. I mentioned a moment ago that I'm honored, and I want to emphasize that I'm truly honored because I know it's rare for such a large group of people to gather to place, especially a group that's in the same discipline and has the same shared values. I often laugh that I'm sure these are values that we all can relate to in terms of our non-professional, non-behavior analytic worlds, where we try to explain to someone what we do and we get kind of that epic, I'm sorry, what did you just say about behavior environment? And I'll say, what kind of response, right? So I like that we all have not only our connection in our personal world, but also, excuse me, I have to get the little clicker thing here going in the right space. I apologize, guys. But also in our personal world, as I just mentioned. I'm not sure why I like to go with the confused mushroom to kind of drive home my point about the fact that we all share these values and how we understand that some people don't know where we're coming from when they're not behavior analysts. So my purpose today is really just to try to help further strengthen our reliance on the science that informs our field. And I really think when we come into a new phase, looking at behavior analytic practitioners that don't necessarily have the same training that some other people that have been practicing for decades, it doesn't mean we're better. But training was different a long time ago. There was a heavy emphasis across the domains. And so I really want to do this with a little bit of, I guess, kind of a call to action when it comes to the appropriate dissemination of our field, especially for behavior analytic practitioners that might not have the same foundation in the theory and philosophy and experimental analysis that really informs our applied practice. And I'm also wanting to do it to decrease potential conflict. And I don't just mean conflict with our stakeholders. I mean some conflict amongst ourselves. And yes, I just fairly quickly jumped from saying I love being together and we have shared values to talking about whether or not we might be fighting amongst ourselves. Well, to be frank, we've always fought amongst ourselves. I don't know if anyone remembers the Alamo. That's an actual real reference, by the way. All right. So there's a lot of years of, RFT, stimulus equivalence, VB, PRT. We're going to get into inner behaviorism versus radical behaviorism. The list goes on and on. This is just the tip of the iceberg. But what's important to acknowledge right now with what we're going through as a society is that even if we had absolutely no history whatsoever of ever arguing amongst ourselves, even if we were one large, happy group that had one giant, almost like a happy marriage, right? Those happen all the time in our field, right? Okay. Given right now what's going on in society, we actually should be fighting. That should be expected. And as behavior analysts that are experts in the science of human behavior, we should be aware that the aversive contingencies that are happening in our world, not just our field, are going to increase the likelihood for conflict. Like I just said, in case you didn't notice, it's been kind of a difficult couple of years, right? There's a ton of bad stimulus pairings that are going on, right? Most occurring during severe and abrupt changes to our typical environmental settings. These increased presence of these aversive contingencies, increased challenges, stressors, and concerns. We are at a significant risk for these things to escalate to conflict, which is not necessarily always a bad thing, but if it's unnecessary, I'm going to argue that it is. I think it's very worrisome. I think it's very understandable, like I just said, yet extremely worrisome, especially for a group of professionals that had already committed ourselves to decreasing human suffering, right? Now, some may argue that because that's what our worldview is and that's what we've thrown ourselves into, that we somehow should have been able to better navigate everything that came along with the pandemic and injustice and be fine because we're in it, right? Well, I think at the same time, we need to recognize that we're the ones that are the experts in knowing that all of our thoughts, feelings, emotions, and behaviors, and just insert full body behavior environment relation here is going to be messed up right now. And you can just label them all circa 2020 to 2022. Okay, that's how I think about it. Now, in applied behavior analysis, I feel like we've been facing those societal level stressors on top of some of the most significant field-related stressors that we've ever faced, right? There's an increased need for ABA services with limited available resources. We have debates about whether or not we should be providing services at all. We've even questioned about whether or not anything we're doing is even worth it. Let's be frank, all right? Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that things have been more difficult for us, right? Everyone is facing pressures right now, but I am saying that it's likely important that as a discipline, we've gone through facing the pandemic and social injustice while simultaneously really having to ask ourselves if we suck, All right, let's be real on that. And that could be a little bit more challenging than some of the people in our personal lives to understand what that's like on a daily basis. So, well, to suck, that would mean that we are failing to provide good ABA services. Now, I don't want to diminish this because it's important to acknowledge that in the worst case, failing to provide appropriate services can mean harm, right? So we have to ask ourselves, do we suck? If so, why, right? In the past, we've had a tendency to jump right to wanting to associate this topic with potential deficits in training and wanting to have increased support. But recently, my colleagues and I have become a little worried that although it's always good to say we could have problems, let's look at our training, let's look at our supports, let's look at our accreditation, let's look at our credentialing, let's increase the standards. What if we're teaching the wrong thing? Not just that they're not getting enough of the right training, right? Not that we're not just learning what ABA is supposed to be about. What if people are teaching the wrong thing? If people are learning the wrong thing about what it's supposed to be about, right? So in other words, what are the possible effects of inadequate, deficient, and incomplete understanding for that which defines behavior analytic practice? It's probably not a good thing, all right? I'm worried. I'm worried we have a problem here. I often think about polls, right? I was thinking if I were to poll a bunch of medical doctors, I'm pretty sure if you ask them what the primary branches of medicine are, they would be able to label those, okay? I'm not as confident that if we polled behavior analytic practitioners on what the primary branches, or sometimes referred to the domains, are, that they would necessarily be able to say those. So this begs the question of whether we all have a shared understanding for science, and specifically how more popularized definitions of science differ from that which defines science and behavior analysis, because they do. If we don't have the answer to this question, how can we even begin to tackle larger questions like improving quality of life? On a good note, I am here to argue that the only way for us not only to survive, but to thrive is to make sure that we 100% can guarantee that we have a shared and accurate understanding for our foundational values. And moreover, how doing so, I believe, will dramatically mitigate the risks associated with many of the challenges that we're currently facing. So let's be clear. The field of behavior analysis is not based on science. It is a science. It's a natural science approach to understanding behavior. And as such, practitioners must rely on both science and behavior analysis across all professional endeavors. So not just our clinical programming, right? But absolutely every aspect of all administrative and clinical activities, including our interactions with each other. So with this, we certainly aren't scientists only insofar that we're conducting and publishing studies, right? Nor are we only scientists insofar that we have the skills to identify what a pseudoscientific study is, right? What defines us as scientists includes all of the attitudes that come along with that, right? Those established by the broader scientific community, skepticism, the skepticism, that's it. That's all I'm gonna go with today, guys. It's been a long weekend, all right? So taken together, in the science of behavior analysis, it means both to rely on the published studies, also to engage in the critical analyses, and to employ these attitudes across everything that we're doing, right? Or what I'm calling our shared value system. In other words, those have 7 dimensions. They're not just for a kiddo, autism, or, all of this worded differently. When a behavior analyst identifies as a scientist, the self-identification, again, is very different from another type of scientist saying that. Why? Because we really have 2 completely unwavering points, all right, of unification. Number 1 is the natural science approach that I was just describing to you guys a bit. But of equal value and just as important is that we have this one really singular, all-defining concept, all right? And that would be that behavior is a function of environment. So not only are we united because we're scientists, and that means that we follow the scientific approach to clarify, that also means, of course, that we base our procedures on published investigations, right? I'm not saying that. But when we say science, we're not just referring to the studies that support the procedures that we're doing, right? I hope I made that clear to this point. I was a little rough warming up, thank you. So differentiating between behavior analytic processes and procedures is crucial, because if a procedure doesn't work and you don't know the why, we're not gonna get very far, right? I have met many practitioners that don't seem to understand that over here, these are our procedures. Discrete trial training, natural environment training. I'll get in fights with people when I say ACT as well, but that's okay. I can argue anytime. There's procedures, okay? Over here are our processes, our principles, the behavioral mechanisms in operation, generalization, reinforcement, discrimination. The science-based foundation of our field has to do with the evidence that supports that those are learning processes that are going on all the time. I very much worry, I think of polls a lot, but if you were to ask a bunch of practitioners if Pavlov's work had anything to do with what the work they do, they would be like, no. And that is a statement that would sound absurd to the vast majority of leaders that founded our field. It's also kind of unfortunate when we're looking at amazing things like trauma-informed care. I actually had a conversation with a colleague the other day, and she was lovely. She said, "Oh my gosh, Rachel, you're right. I don't know how it's gotten this bad. I don't think this is what Skinner's vision is." And right when she said that, I was like, dude didn't think SR psychology was going to go away. All right. Like, I think we're a little confused on what we're talking about in terms of the practices that we're doing and the science that informs it. This sometimes comes up in terms of being confused about our technical language. I often give the example that I will correct someone if they say the kiddo didn't generalize it, and I will say, no, we need to say we didn't observe generalization. When I do that, if I were to just leave it at that, I could see how that would definitely perpetuate some concerns about behavior analysts being a little too hoity-toity, right? I'm just waving my PhD flag. I'm going to correct you. Actually, they need to say that we didn't observe it. No, I need to explain why I'm saying that. And actually, the why is of clinical significance. Why am I going to correct someone to say the kid didn't generalize it to instead say we didn't observe generalization? Because you're putting the locus of control in the child. The moment I then say, hey, we need to say we didn't observe generalization, and let's say I'm talking to a teacher that's working with a student, what happens then? Now we're all oriented to what we're doing, right? What is happening in the environment. So I'm going to argue that our technical language is incredibly helpful in that moment, as long as we explain it and don't just leave it at that's an inaccurate definition, right? No, like there's a clinical significance to making sure that we understand that. Because if we put it inside the child, guess what? Saying the kid didn't generalize it, we're now blaming them, okay? And I'm pretty sure that that's not what we all got in here to do. Okay, so in the end, I think my other concern too is obviously a lack of understanding of how these processes are going on all the time, the basic behavior environment interactions, right? They are influencing absolutely every single one of our interactions and absolutely every single moment in a session with a child as well, or with an adult. So if we do not understand this, then I probably shouldn't be too surprised that I worry that when some people say behavior is a function of environment, they think I'm talking about access to tangibles, estate, attention. Like, no, guys, this is everything. So the drastic risks associated with our potential to fail have been highlighted by recent public opposition, right? So expressed experiences are wide-ranging, from uncompassionate practitioner rapport, meaningful goal selection, aversive clinical querying procedures. I appreciate Dr. Leaf being in the room for helping to acknowledge these. These are his things that he has written about as well. These are concerns, just to name a few. As another example, it was actually in July, I believe, I've actually looked at my notes, 2021, an independent group did a ratified resolution against ABAI, a residential provider group, right? So we have concerns here. So in some ways, we need to realize that in the past, like what we've done is that we've said, okay, we're ready to come together in these concerns and say, no, we're here to show you. This is our research that shows that we're doing it right. We're correct. Let me show you all the studies that back what we do. If you've experienced harm, the benefits of an expert touting to you the research that should back the fact that you shouldn't have experienced harm is probably not going to be very helpful, right? So we need to take a moment and say, if we're facing this, I think we're all at this point now that we know this, but we need to listen. We need to learn, and then at the same time, we need to cite the research that backs all the work that we do, but we need to acknowledge that. And I think we're all very familiar with that at this point. I hope, if not, you haven't had the same kind of week I've had, right? So on that note, to alleviate human suffering and decrease unnecessary conflict, I wanna just emphasize again that behavior analysts must recognize personal frustrations by first listening and then supporting investigations, but again, still standing behind the research that backs the amazing work that we've done for decades upon decades upon decades. Much of this results from a little personal experience here. I'll make it quick. Even if you're not a fan of Star Wars, that's okay. Stay with me, all right? We were binge watching The Mandalorian, and I think my husband was kind enough to get an Airbnb so we could escape with our 17-year-old and 6-year-old. That's fun, right? And at one point we're watching it, and Mando is dealing with two factions in the desert, all right? These factions always fight against each other. They're always in conflict. And Mando was there because the sand monster was going to kill all of them. Sand monster does not care which faction's which, right? And in the middle of a moment, these two factions started arguing with each other, and Mando stopped it and said, if we fight amongst ourselves, the monster's going to kill us all. And my poor husband, because there I am. It's my field, right? Like I can't even watch this show. I'm like, I think I was over there. And, you know, I mean, I'm half joking, but I really was obnoxious about it. Okay, so unfortunately, it did make me think of all of us and think about, oh, what are we going to do? Because if we have a united front, We know we can help decrease human suffering. We know we can continue to do good work. When we're fighting amongst ourselves, the monster is going to kill us, right? So again, given what we know about human behavior under these unusually aversive conditions, it's likely important for us to openly acknowledge our current increased risk for conflict that I started with. But now we're looking at begging the question of, do we have a monster? All right. And I'm gonna say, unfortunately, yes, we do. All right. In fact, ours is the most wicked and cruel. It can shapeshift, allowing the aversive effects of its attacks to go undetected for long periods of time. But don't forget, we can all get along with the monsters inside our head. No one's with me. No one's cool enough. Right? Come on, I need some smiles, guys. It's hard with the mask on, okay? Right? Just want to keep it up after midnight. Am I too old with the other example? No, right? Make sure you don't put water on it. No one's with me on these things. Okay. We can get along with the monsters, all right? I'm going to argue that our monster is appropriate case conceptualization. If anyone's hanging out with me later, I'll have no problem telling you about our first submission to a journal on this topic, where we said the monster was anti-science. We realized real quick that one of the reviewers thought we were talking about just conducting published studies and research, and not what we were talking about that I just described this whole time. Interestingly, when I replaced the entire paper from anti-science to case conceptualization, it worked. Okay, clearly we have some kind of a problem going on, right? So this is how we talk about case conceptualization. I'm not trying to do a pitch for a talk, but I'm talking later today and I spend quite a bit more time on this. So I'm going to do it pretty briefly right now. And if you miss it, I'm not shutting up about this anytime soon. So I'm happy. There's something else going on during my talk, so you might not be able to read. Anyway, I promise you, when you dig into this, you're going to see that when we look at case conceptualization, we need to be looking across all three of these things. And what I have been talking about increasingly lately is that our credentialing and our accreditation appropriately looks at our procedures and our outcomes, all right? But we need to be looking across all of these things, and taken together, we're looking at appropriate case conceptualization. And I know that if we can take the time to ensure that we're not just looking at the procedures and the outcomes and the procedures that we're doing to get towards quality of life, right? That we are encompassing all of these things together to say we are doing socially meaningful goals. So as we continue our collective discussions of how best to ensure the survival of our field, I'm saying it's crucial that we remember that while we may fail to agree on certain things, that our failure is not a representative of the field on the whole. And if someone is engaging in poor practices, that is also not representative of the field on a whole. And on the same note, when an ABA or BCBA may recommend inappropriate service goals or inadequate procedures, those recommendations should not define the overall quality of ABA services on a whole. Those are things that we need to look and engage in the systems that we have in place to ensure that the appropriate regulatory bodies are stepping in and doing their job, right? That is what we need to do, just like any other human service discipline. I can tell you, other disciplines have gone through some changes over the time, right? Okay, we don't want to be in the dark ages with medicine right now in terms of physiological interventions. So as we come together to tackle the myriad of stressors that we're all facing, I just want to make the argument that I believe we're going to have to look at both science and alleviating human suffering in order to move together with a united front. So we're doing a lot of related work at CalABA. I'm not going to get too far into this, but you see that first image there. I joke with Dr. Wallace. She was my master's thesis advisor. So it is she's written maybe just a couple textbooks. So it's very nice that this many years later, Dr. Wallace is the director of research for the organization that we founded and launched. And it's fun for me to know that if we want to change every intro to ABA textbook, I might have the right person to do it. We've been thinking more about the domains, and maybe we need to revisit how we're training these, because those are things that come up in the master's level training as well, not just the PhD level. I am not talking about changing the branches or domains of behavior analysis. I'm talking about acknowledging that if we say theory and philosophy is at our foundation, and we refer to ABA as one branch, I think, I'm not going to call you out the whole time, Justin, but I think I made the joke with Justin at the beginning of this article. It says that ABA is one of three branches. He's clearly not from UNR, by the way. Anyway, one of three, not four. So how no one's listening? Okay, one of three branches. I know people are reading that article looking to want to oppose, looking to want to be upset. I have made for good reason. They're a product of their own environment. They're a product of their own history, right? My first thought was there's going to be people who read that and they're going to think, oh, it's only one. I wonder if the other two are better, right? Like, so we're having a problem in terms of how we're teaching these domains. And I think we need to relook at this and say, maybe we need to be saying ABA is here. And if you're going to practice, then you need to make sure that every decision you're making, you're filtering through theory and philosophy, you're filtering through EAD, believe it or not. And then the original article by Cooper and Moore had called it service delivery, but I think that's where we need to go with our professional standards. So this is just a tip of an iceberg, but I wanted everyone to hear that just briefly. We also need to continue to support our membership organizations. This is the place where we should feel safe amongst each other. This is not a regulatory body. ABAI is not the police, all right? CalABA, same thing. ABA, same thing. Okay, nor is the BACB, and we can all have our issues, but that is a credentialing authority, and there's a process if someone could potentially be in violation of their certification. They are the ones who make that decision. ABAI only accredits graduate training programs. So we have to realize who are the regulatory people here and who are the ones that are supporting us as members to come together and talk about issues. And I'm worried that a lot of people don't know the differences. And to me, if we don't understand all of the contingencies in operation, we have no chance of affecting appropriate social change. So even though it could sound like I'm not paying attention to what the critical issues are, and it kills me, I do not like thinking that there's a topic about a vulnerable population and potential harm. And I'm like, I need to talk about how ABAI works, but I do, because we need to understand the systems that we're operating in order to make these changes. So on that last note, I just want to do a couple other kumbaya moments, all right? And it's really just, I hope we can stop and say, we are experts in human behavior. We know what can happen to make people more frustrated, more upset. We know that the challenges in our society right now, outside of our field, should it increase the likelihood for us to be arguing amongst ourselves, having nothing to do with anything we're doing, right? Stimulus, stimulus, pairings, aversive, aversive, aversive. We are all at an increased likelihood to be fighting. So as experts, we should be coming into an interaction and be acknowledging that. We should be aware of the fact that we are at an increased likelihood to get escalated. Now, some people are going to argue that sometimes getting escalated and fighting is necessary. Okay, well then let's talk about why, why? And let's go through that. Are you considering the potential effects of your behavior on the future responding of the listener? Okay, great. Where do we think that's going to go? It takes time, but you know what? There's a lot of really wonderful people that have studied this for a really long time. And I'm pretty sure that if we follow that path, as painful as it can be, we can get back to the other side, all right? So in closing, I'm going to read a quote here. It's not me. It's actually the last CalABA conference chair. I got to be the CalABA conference chair in March of 2020. That was a lot of fun. The last CalABA conference chair, here's what she said. She said, natural laws do not change simply because one is having lunch with friends discussing politics or social justice issues versus a professional setting in which one is analyzing the contingencies under which said behaviors occur. Imagine a world in which we all appreciated the value of looking to environmental variables to explain behavior in an objective manner, rather than potentially searching for ways to assign blame to other humans for our suffering. This has been the vision of our field since the beginning, and failure to extend it across all areas of our lives is a noteworthy concern. Dr. Heidi Adlers. In the end, I am going to dedicate this to Theta and Mu. If you're not familiar, we lost two incredible people and they're tragic people. I can get emotional still having to do it. So one second to my butt. Sorry, guys. Give me a second. I can do it because I get to make fun of Theta. So I realize it's the best way to close this. I was thinking about it right before CalABA. We did this symposium there. We were honored to do that. And I thought, well, what would Theta say if she heard this? She would have said, wow, Rachel, did you just spend 20 minutes telling your whole field that y'all need to knock off your personal crap so you can keep helping people? And then, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's all I just did, Theta. Thank you, guys.